Playing an instrument requires much more than simply knowing scales and keys and note lengths. It's not unlike becoming proficient in a physical sport, where you have to learn the rules and strategies of the sport and also spend several years developing the fine motor control needed to sink a long shot in basketball or throw a powerful pitch in baseball with good aim. To become truly proficient at a musical instrument requires practicing for thousands of hours. I'd say that 5,000 hours is a reasonable minimum to be able to play at a professional level. That's 3 hours every single day for more than 4 years. With the piano, all of the action is in the hands and fingers. A good pianist can play many notes at once while applying different amounts of force with each finger to bring out important parts of the melody and harmony, keeping other notes in the background. A pianist also needs to develop independence to play completely different parts with each hand. The same applies to bass players who sing. They have to be able to think and perform 2 different melody lines at the same time. That's more difficult than singing while strumming guitar chords. Independence is even more difficult for drummers who use both hands and both feet to play 4 different parts at once. There are many jokes about drummers, but a good drummer is every bit as skilled as any other musician. With bowed instruments, the main challenge is controlling the bow speed and downward force to create a smooth, even volume without making a scratching sound. For blown instruments, the player's mouth shape, called embouchure, and breath control are the most difficult skills to master. Watching a violinist's fingers flying in a fast passage might seem like that aspect of playing is more difficult, but it's not. The bow, or breath, are the voice of these instruments, and everything else is subservient. This is why right-handed players hold the bow in the right hand. Good players practice every scale and arpeggio in every possible key for many years, as well as pieces from the standard literature. This Chopin Etude, Opus 10 No. 1, is based heavily on arpeggios that span many musical keys, so you can see why practicing arpeggios is so important. Likewise for scales, such as Etude No. 4 in the same Opus 10 series. Improvising is simply composing in real time. The more accomplished one is with their instrument, the faster and easier it is to translate musical ideas into sound. Being accomplished with a keyboard instrument is especially important for composers. When you can play complex harmonies quickly, that not only makes composing go faster, it also lets you try out new ideas more easily. It took me 9 months to write my cello concerto, but it took Antonin Dvorak only 6 weeks to write his, and I assure you, his concerto is a lot better than mine. It's also longer. I mentioned earlier that it took me several hours to analyze Bach Chorale No. 8, which is only 20 bars long. That was mostly because it took me so long to play all the notes simultaneously on the piano to be able to hear them in context. Having perfect pitch means you can identify a single note in isolation just by hearing it, without needing other notes for reference. Few people possess this skill inherently, though it can be developed with practice. In my opinion, a more important skill for musicians is relative pitch, which means you can tell if notes are in tune or not in the context of a performance. I've noticed that the singers who do best on shows like American Idol are also the ones with the most accurate and stable pitch. When I was a teenager, my cellist girlfriend at the time came from a musical family. Every time she walked past the piano in their living room, she'd play the A note above middle C. I often pluck the high E string on my guitar as I walk by it. If you do this every day, eventually you can hear the pitch in your head just by imagining you're about to play that note. I've written several articles about playing music, and I often get emails from adults who are considering taking up an instrument for the first time. One question they all ask is whether it's possible to become proficient starting at such a late age. My standard answer is that some people have more innate ability than others, but if music really means a lot to you, and you're certain you can tell if you're singing in tune or not, then you probably have the necessary talent. But you still must devote time every day to practicing. Speaking of pitch accuracy, this is a good place to mention quarter tones and other notes that are not precisely at the standard note frequencies. Notes can be played ever so slightly sharp or flat for expression or effect. If not for the note's entire duration, a musician may slide up to a note from a lower pitch. Playing a note slightly flat can project a sense of calm, and playing slightly sharp adds tension. I'm talking about extremely small amounts, on the order of 5 or 10 cents, hundredths of a musical half-step. Playing off-pitch on purpose is easy with fretless instruments such as the violin or cello, and wind instrument players do that by varying their embouchure. Guitar players change the pitch in large or small amounts by bending the strings. Musicians can also play slightly behind the beat or a little ahead, say 10 to 30 milliseconds, to add a sense of calm or tension. When drummers hit the snare a little ahead of time, they are said to be pushing the beat. This video isn't meant to teach musical instruments, but it's useful to understand a little about how they're played. Besides the usual tempo and dynamic markings, other specific instructions are often written into printed music, such as slurs and legato and staccato note lengths. String players use the bow speed, pressure, and placement to vary the volume and tone color while sustaining a note. The harder you press, and the faster the bow moves, the louder and brighter the sound will be. Likewise, blowing a wind instrument with more force makes the notes brighter sounding as well as louder. Where along the string's length you bow or pluck also affects the tone color. Bowing or plucking close to the bridge gives a brighter, thinner sound. By the way, playing with a bow is called arco style, and plucking the strings is called pizzicato. It's also important to be able to keep notes uniformly strong over their duration when that's called for, as mentioned earlier. This is very difficult. When done well, the sound becomes solid and authoritative, almost like a recording studio compressor effect was applied. The same applies for blown instruments in the human voice. The more consistent the volume is, the more powerful the sound will be, especially for soft passages where beginners tend to wimp out and let notes trail off weakly at the end. In fact, this is one reason compressors are used in recording studios, to make performers sound more solid and consistent. The notes on a piano are easily identified by their color and placement, so it's easy to find any given note. Blown instruments have keys or valves that, when pressed, create different pitches, or holes that you cover with your fingers, as with the flute. Guitars and most electric basses have frets, as well as markers along the neck to help players navigate their instrument. But fretless instruments such as the violin and string bass have no such markers, so players rely on what I call anchor points to find their way. There are 2 thumb stops on the neck of instruments in the violin family. One is called the heel, where the neck joins the body, and the other is the chin at the far end near the tuning pegs. In this next example, I find the E note partway up the neck by sliding my hand until my thumb hits the heel stop, then find a B flat note near the chin thumb stop. Finally, I play the G note above the E by first finding the F sharp above E, then using feel and practice, I know how much higher the G note is. Anchor points are different for a violin because violin notes are much closer together, so with your thumb at the heel, you can access a very wide range of notes based on how far your hand stretches or contracts. A guitar can play more than 2 octaves without shifting your hand position up or down the neck, which makes it easy to play a range of notes quickly and accurately. An electric bass can also play a note range greater than an octave without shifting, though most basses have only 4 strings, so the range is smaller than for a guitar, which has 6 strings. A violin can also play several octaves in one position because the strings are relatively short. In other words, you don't have to stretch very far to span several musical whole steps. But a cello can't play more than 3 scale notes in a row without shifting, except in first position using the open strings. This makes the cello a more physical instrument, requiring a fair amount of movement. However, higher up on the neck of a cello, the notes are closer together, so cellists use thumb position, which lets them play a range spanning several octaves without having to shift. Legato and staccato were explained earlier, so let's visit that again to see how these are played on some specific instruments. Pianos have dampers that press against the strings when a key is released, which in turn stops the note from sounding. So to play legato, you hold each note until the next note begins, and to play staccato, you simply do that with your fingers. You can also use the sustain pedal, which raises the dampers for all strings at once, making it easy to play sustained passages without having to hold every note for its full duration. Piano players know when and how to use the pedal automatically, though ped and asterisk marks can be used to show where to press and release the pedal. The notes in both of these next examples are struck the same way, but the second time uses the sustain pedal. This cello music shows the same phrase played 4 different ways, first using a separate legato bow stroke for each note, then again with short staccato bow strokes. The next example on the lower line uses slurs to indicate note pairs played with one bow direction, then with separate bow strokes in a style called spiccato, where the bow is bounced on the string to create an even stronger staccato effect. Note the down bow and up bow markings, which tell the player which bow direction to use. For a solo performance, the bow direction is at the player's discretion, but for a section in an orchestra, it's best if all players bow in the same direction, not only for appearance, but for consistency of the sound. A down bow can be louder and stronger because the hand presses the bow downward on the string directly. An up bow requires more leverage to get the same amount of force at the far end of the bow away from the hand. So a down bow is good for playing downbeats and strong passages, while an up bow makes it easier to play soft, gentle phrases or play a sustained note that swells in volume over time. Blown instruments such as the trumpet use a combination of breath control and the player's tongue to control note duration. For slower passages, you simply blow and stop blowing, but for fast passages, players can press their tongue against the roof of their mouth to interrupt the flow of air. This technique, called tonguing, can be controlled more quickly and precisely than using the lung muscles to stop and start the notes. In this next example from Scheherazade by Rimsky-Korsakov, the trumpet players use triple tonguing to create very fast groups of notes precisely. Vibrato is a recurring up and down pitch variation that adds color and interest to sustained notes. With a bowed instrument or fretless bass, you rock your hand from side to side while the note sustains, which varies the effective string length. Pedal steel guitars can also use vibrato by sliding the bar left and right. The same technique works on regular guitars too, using a metal or glass slide instead of pressing your fingers down firmly. This clip from my television music video shows using a metal slide with an acoustic guitar. With fretted instruments, you can stretch the strings to raise the pitch, but you can't go lower unless you first stretch the string before striking it. Then you can go higher or lower from there. Baroque music styles often relish the pure, if plain, sound of open strings, but most modern string music avoids that sound, preferring the warmth of vibrato. This next example shows the difference between the open D string on the cello, the same D note played on the G string, then again with vibrato added. Indeed, maintaining a strong and consistent vibrato over a note's entire duration is another aspect of playing that's very difficult to master, especially with string instruments where you have to prepare the shape of your hand to play the next note while continuing a rocking motion for the current note. A vibrato bar lets you smoothly shift all of the strings on an electric guitar higher or lower in pitch by a large amount, especially lower. This device is also called a whammy bar, or, incorrectly, a tremolo bar. Most blown instruments can also apply vibrato. Trombones can easily shift the pitch up or down simply by moving the slide, but saxophones can only go higher in pitch. Sax players do this by repeatedly pressing their lip against and away from the vibrating reed, which bends the reed slightly and raises the pitch.
You move your bottom lip slightly. You don't want to physically see this. But if you like get a microscope to your lip, like physically you're moving your bottom lip, or your jaw. It depends. This is without vibrato. This is with vibrato.
Unlike vibrato that repeatedly varies the pitch, tremolo instead raises and lowers the volume. This is difficult to control on a blown or bowed instrument, but electric guitar players do it easily using the volume control. Another device for string instruments is harmonics. This is different from the series of overtone frequencies that accompany the fundamental pitch and give each instrument its unique tone color. When used as a playing technique, harmonics are created by lightly touching the string with your finger halfway along its length. This creates a pure tone, having fewer overtones than when the string is pressed firmly against the fingerboard. You can press lightly at other integer divisions, such as 1/3 and 1/4 the string length. Good players can also press the string firmly against the neck to establish a new bass length, then touch lightly at various places along the new shorter length. These are called artificial harmonics, and they're easier to play on a violin than a cello, where you have to use your thumb. However, it's more difficult generally to play a violin in tune because being off by even 1/32 of an inch affects the pitch more than on a cello. Harmonics are also useful when tuning an instrument by listening for a beat tone. This is a slow volume undulation that occurs when two notes differ very slightly in pitch. Tuning with beat tones is especially useful with bass instruments because our ears are less sensitive to small pitch changes at low frequencies. I made this next example for my audio expert book, and it's worth including here too. Guitar players have two other devices called hammer-on and pull-off that pluck the string using the left hand. These terms were first coined by Pete Seeger in his 1948 book, How to Play the Five-String Banjo. Hammer-on means you press the string down quickly and firmly with your left hand, rather than pluck it as usual with the right hand. The note is not as loud as when plucked separately, but a good player can make the sound loud and clear enough. A pull-off is similar, but instead of pushing down to sound the note, you pull your finger off the string sideways, setting it in motion. This next example shows both techniques. A A variation on this technique is called tapping, which is a combination of hammer-ons and pull-offs, using a finger on the right hand rather than a pick. Heavy metal guitar players do this all the time, as my friend Ugur de Riveren demonstrates here. In the second pass played slowly, you can clearly see the sideways pull-offs. Pull-offs work equally well on the violin and cello, and this has been done since long before Pete Seeger's banjo book, though with classical instruments it's called left-hand pizzicato, as played in this next example by violinist David Gale, performing Paganini's Caprice No. 24, written in the early 1800s. The first note in each group is plucked with the right hand as usual, but the rest are sounded by pulling the string sideways as each finger is lifted. Although it's not related directly to music theory, many musicians suffer from performance anxiety, which for some people can be debilitating. This is the same as the common fear of public speaking. Some people can address an auditorium full of people and remain calm and relaxed. Others tense up, their voice shakes, and they sweat profusely. Musicians who suffer from performance anxiety often experience rubber fingers, and their bow hand shakes uncontrollably. One solution is beta blockers, a heart medicine that reduces the physical effects of performance anxiety. Beta blockers are sometimes referred to as the musician's underground drug because they're often used but rarely talked about. And because they're a drug, some people are strongly opposed to them. My own opinion is to use beta blockers if you need them, as I've done several times when playing cello solos in front of hundreds of people. Of course, there's no substitute for practice. When I was preparing for the debut performance of my cello concerto in 1998, I stayed late after every weekly orchestra rehearsal when everyone else had left. I played through the entire piece to an empty auditorium just to get used to being on the stage looking out over all those seats. That helped me enormously when the performance day finally arrived. The description for this video contains a link to an article that offers a more detailed examination of beta blockers. Unfortunately, the opposite applies to some classical musicians. Take away their music and they don't know what to do. Reading music requires mapping notes on the printed page to physical finger locations on the instrument in real time. Many blown instruments can play the same notes with different finger combinations and, for string instruments, on different strings and positions along the neck. So part of the art of playing is knowing which combination of fingers and strings will play the notes in a given passage most efficiently or with a given tone color. Notes played high up in the neck on a low string have a darker, more mellow tone than the same note played on a high string. Reading music is important if you intend to play professionally because it's the most efficient way to get the composer's notes into the player's hands. But many great rock and pop musicians can't read music, and many jazz musicians can read the chords on a lead sheet, but not the melody notes. You'll never play in an orchestra if you can't read music, nor is a job in Jay Leno's Tonight Show band possible. But some of the best players I know can't read music at all, and Paul McCartney has stated publicly that he can't read music. That sure didn't stop him from writing dozens of amazing songs. So being able to read music might be important, but not being able to read music never kept someone with talent from expressing themselves fully. It takes several months of steady practice to become reasonably fluent at reading music, and many years to master reading at a high level. When reading music, you're always reading ahead of the current notes because your brain has to automatically and subconsciously plan and prepare for the upcoming fingering. For blown instruments, the player also has to prepare for changes in embouchure or mouth shape. Professional musicians need to play without looking at their own hands because they have to read the music while watching the conductor or band leader. As an aside, an alternate type of music for guitar players is called tablature, or simply tab, which uses a picture of notes on the guitar neck rather than notes on a staff. I'm not a fan of guitar tab because for the same effort you could have learned to read real music notation. There's a big difference between following simple examples like those shown here and being able to sight read complex music on the spot. Sight reading requires much more experience and practice than basic music reading. But if you are able to follow the examples in this video, congratulations, you now know the basics of reading music.